Sometimes very tense relationships between different segments of civil society, and how do you build consensus. So I'll use the gap example to look at that. And the second bit I'll pick up on is your point you made right at the fag end on partnership. Then none of us can do this alone, and Banashri said this as well. So how do we really move forward in a way that that legitimately protects our, the voices that we are putting forward, but at the same time, so we're not compromising, but we're working in partnership and in collaboration. So I think those are two things that GAP has taught us, and I'm sort of happy to start from that point. In terms of just a very quick overview of GAP, and we were inspired to set up GAP because of two things. One was that 20 years ago, when Habitat 2 took place and Kirtibai was there, there was still a lot of civil society there, but it was not organized. And part of the result of that was that civil society voices got lost in the negotiation process. They were all talking about their own little agendas. There was a lot of diffusion. There was a lot of noise. But there was less of a sort of coherence in that process. The second part was linked to that was that at this point in time, there was really no global platform that existed to present positions of civil society to member states. And remember, these are all intergovernmental agreements. We are there really at the invitation and the pleasure of the member states. They can kick us out anytime. Unfortunately, that is the real reality of UN geopolitics, that member states are the bosses in that room. They choose to hear civil society or they don't. In Quito, which was an open meeting, civil society had a very loud voice. But we would not have got there, and we would not have got our inputs into the new urban agenda had we not structurally and systematically engaged with the process in the 2 years that led to Quito. And that was the role of the General Assembly of Partners when it was formed. So what we did was that we looked at the major groups that had an interest and a stake in urbanization and in sustainable urban development. And we brought those groups together, including the 9 major groups of the UN, which is typically women, children and youth, scientific technical committee, farmers, indigenous people, etc. And then we added more and more groups to say grassroots are not represented. Philanthropies are not represented. They're becoming a big player in this, in the whole sort of global donor community and others. So we set up this General Assembly of Partners with 14 partner constituent groups, trade unions, business and industry, philanthropies and foundations, grassroots, civil society as a more of a catch-all, research and academia, professionals. So there's 16 groups, and there's a list that you can look at. 14 and then expanded to 16. 2 more groups applied to join the GAP, and they were persons with disabilities and older persons, traditionally not having a voice at the UN. Very, very weak voice at the UN, but very, very important in the context of urbanization today. So we basically brought these groups together, and we started talking, and inevitably there were tensions. Inevitably, trade unions would say something and business and industry would say, forget it. Or grassroots and indigenous would say something, and local authorities would say, what are you talking about? We don't believe this, So inevitably there were tensions. And what we did, our big lesson from this was, we cannot get consensus on everything. You have to try and build consensus on a minimum. So not lowest common denominator, Kirtibai, but most important structural or most important, let's say, key ingredients. Essential things, key principles. If we can agree on those, then I think the others can follow. The second principle that we laid down was that we are not going to be gatekeepers. GAP is not, first of all, going to be the platform through which everybody has to funnel to get to Quito. No. There's plenty of other civil society out there who may not want to be, everybody doesn't want to be coordinated, everybody doesn't want to join a platform to speak, people want to retain their independence. At the same time, we said, if you're advocating for certain positions with GAP, we're also not going to stop you from advocating for certain particular positions for your own constituent group. If the indigenous people have certain particular concerns, and they're not agreed on by the rest of the 16 constituent groups, it doesn't mean that we're not going to table those concerns or we're going to prevent them from tabling those concerns. So that was the second principle that we had, and I think that's very, very important in any civil society process, also in a place as diverse as India. A third bit was this whole business of people feeling that, are we riding 2 horses or 3 horses? Are we selling out? And this is a very, very strong feeling, not just in India and South Asia, where civil society has had traditionally a very, very strong activist role and a strong positioning as a mirror to government role, but also Latin America. So do you really want to be in the same room as member states? Well, yes, if you're not in the same room as member states, you're knocking on the door from outside, nobody is listening to you. So I think it's not a compromise, it's a process, it's a conscious strategy to engage. The space, as Manishri said, in this country on civil society, and I can take another 3 hours on that, but this is not a good moment, is shrinking dramatically. It's being made to shrink through systematic interventions. And we are the first ones to shout about it. It's very important. But at the same time, how do we retain what we have? How do we still retain a foot in the door? Because if we don't, then we are shut out. And we don't influence policy by holding up placards only. So that was the GAP strategy, that we have to fight for the right issues, but we have to fight sitting in the room. If we fight from outside the United Nations, we're just another bunch of people making noise. And that, I think, is very, very important. So for India, I think an important bit is to look at the 16 partner constituent groups of GAP. We have 16 groups. It's a way of organizing civil society and making sure that no major groups are left behind in the dialogue, because inevitably some groups are louder than others. And some groups have more of a stake but are never heard because they're not as organized, or they don't speak our language. They're not in the room. We never think of inviting them to meetings, etc. So I think it's important to look at the 16 groups of GAP and see that, to make sure that in civil society engagement here, we're not missing out on any, and any that are more relevant to our context as well. You can make those 18, 20, 25, it doesn't matter. But as long as you're not missing out on some core essential groups of civil society that are engaged in the process of urbanization. A second part, very quickly, is to also look at, and Kirti, I'll give you 2 documents for your train ride back home to read. And I would urge you all also to look at them.
Send your children also.
and I can give you my 2 children also. Please take them. They and the 2 documents will keep you busy. 2 documents that I would urge you to read. One is called the Partnerships for the New Urban Agenda. This was a product that was produced by GAP, and it identified 5 areas where partners, civil society could support implementation of the New Urban Agenda. So we are not just fighting for the right words to be included, and we got some of the right words into the agenda. The hooks are there, and I'll come to that in a second. So 5 areas where civil society could work. Advocacy, of course, that's our forte, but also innovation. A lot of knowledge and innovation comes from bottom up and from the grassroots and from the ground. Not just private sector driven innovation, but grassroots level driven innovation, professional driven innovation. It comes from bottom up. A third was knowledge. So research, that's knowledge building from different corners of the world is coming in. A fourth role of civil society is monitoring. If you have top-down indicators, again, this is part of the wider discussion on the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. All the indicators of SDGs, lowest common denominator, very, very quantitative, very, very superficial, very incomplete, will not give you the whole picture at all. How do we get the real picture of what progress is being made on the ground? You can only get that through bottom-up, disaggregated, qualitative data. You can get it through stories and narratives and not just numbers. And I know I'm preaching to converted a little bit, but this is really the role of civil society. To stand up and say, we want to complement your quantitative data, Niti Aayog, with our qualitative assessment of what is going on SDG 11 and on the New Urban Agenda implementation. So that's the 4th role for civil society and stakeholders. And the 5th role is really much more ambitious, is really to try and monitor where the money is going. And when we tabled this in the discussions, that these are our 5 aspirations of how we want to support implementation of the new urban agenda. At the 5th one, the member states did a double take. They're like, what did you say? You want to monitor where we spend the money? I said, yeah, because that's our money that you're spending, by the way, So whether we start from the bottom up, whether we start at the Zilla level, whether we start at the village level, whether we start at the urban local body level, we really have to get into the process of keeping our elected governments accountable. And that is a very important role for civil society in the implementation of these international agendas. Finally, on the hooks and the key themes for India in the new urban agenda, I think as you already said, as Pritha also said in her brief introduction, Kirtibai said, Banashri said, the hooks are there. The words, we've got them. We've got a lot of good words in the new urban agenda. We got the right to the city. Who would have thought that member states would sign a document that mentioned the right to the city? Not only because of GAP, but because of tremendous work that was done by ActionAid, by Citizens' Rights Collective, by Global Platform Right to the City, by many, many other actors who were there, who pushed this agenda. We got the right to the city. We got decent work. So apart from the other standard inclusion, sustainability, etc., we got some words and some phrases which are very important for us as hooks to be able to go back and hold our governments accountable, saying, guys, you committed to decent work. You committed to the right to the city. You committed to inclusion and inclusivity in its widest senses, as you said. And you committed to justice and you committed to equity. How are we going to take this forward? So we've got the hooks. The point is, it's our responsibility to now expand on these and build on these. And what does inclusion mean for us in India? A very good example of looking at what this document offers in terms of what does inclusivity mean for a country like India. It's very different from what it means in Europe. And remember, the new urban agenda and the SDGs are a universal agenda. So they have to be customized and explained and adapted and elaborated for your own context. Otherwise, it's going to mean nothing. That's the first role actually of civil society here. To unpack it, to make it customized and to make it relevant to the Indian context. In terms of final bits, in terms of the key themes that I think we should pursue in India, deriving from the new urban agenda. I'll pick up on the last one which Kirti mentioned, which was planning system reform, one of the last ones you said. I mean, it's very close to my heart. I totally agree with all the words and all the adjectives you used for the Planning Commission. You were very restrained, I must say. Planning system reform, how we do planning, what kind of planning, how we bypass planning all the time actually through missions and through city development strategies and through SPVs and through SEZs, how we actually bypass statutory participatory planning processes is something very critical. The other thing that I think we should pick up on is a very important element in the new urban agenda called national urban policies. For a country like, Rwanda has a national urban policy. For Christ's sake, they just appeared out of conflict after a genocide. They have a national urban policy. A country like India doesn't have a national urban policy. We may be only 31% urban, but we will be 50% urban in the next 20 odd years. And we are not presenting a very great model of urbanization. We have a pretty pathetic model of urbanization. We have an exclusionary, we have an exploitative, we have an unbalanced model of urbanization. How do we correct that? We need to push our governments to prepare something called a national urban policy, which picks up all these disjointed pieces, PMAY, Amrut, Smart City, Urban Mission, and all that jazz. It has to be in a larger context of a national urban policy. I do understand that urbanization is a subject of the states. And coming to Banashri's point on the State Finance Commission's role and the states becoming all more powerful, what we also need after a framework document that at the national level is also a state level urban policy. That's where we need to go back and push and use our connections and use our partnerships with state governments to say, we need a state level urban policy. And a state level urban policy doesn't just mean ki ये क्या प्राइमेट सिटी और क्या 4 cities होंगे और क्या इनमें कनेक्टिविटी होगी? But really, where is the economy? Where are the jobs? What do we want our state to look like? Where are the fragile ecosystems? Which is the protected agricultural land? Which are the vulnerable communities? What do we want to protect? Where is our vulnerability to disaster? We need an urban policy that deals with both urban and rural. So we also not saying that an urban policy cannot exist without the twin side of a national rural policy as well. So I think they're two sides of the same coin. It has to be something that needs to be pursued. A third thing, if we're talking about housing, we're talking about housing for all, the program, and we're talking about shelter for 100 million slum dwellers in this country. It cannot be done with our very old-fashioned approach of ownership-based tenure and housing. We have to fight for a far more creative and innovative set of tools to promote housing for all. Whether it is rental housing, whether it is employee-based housing, whether it is hostels, whether it is slum upgrading, whether it is all kinds of housing solutions need to be pursued. And that is a hook in the new urban agenda that this country needs to do very, very urgently and quickly. We keep talking about China. Well, one thing that China did in the last 20 years was to address its housing crisis in a big way. I'm not saying we follow the China model, but if you just look at the sheer numbers, it's phenomenal. So that's the other bit. Finally, the fifth document that I was recommending, which you also must read, I hope Sandeep will touch upon this a little bit, is something we call the City We Need 2.0. It's got a set of 10 phenomenally good, well-articulated principles on what is the nature of the city we need. Is it regenerative? Is it equitable? Is it just? And what do these terms mean? This was prepared by the World Urban Campaign, which Sandeep co-chairs, and it is really an incredible document that sets out certain very good principles. Please look at that too. So that's the fifth document to add to your armory of reading. I'll leave it there, addressing just one point in 30 seconds on what Banashri said about transformative versus incremental change. I'm worried that incremental change in our context means either just tinkering superficially or doing very piecemeal stuff, which is slow and becomes ineffective and gets lost when one government hands over to another. Not that this government is going anywhere anytime soon, but still. So my concern is that incremental should not mean piecemeal. Incremental should not mean haphazard and disjointed. And what we need today in India is both speed and scale of change. We cannot wait 20 years, as you were saying, to handle the problems we have. Otherwise, frankly speaking, this country is on a very, very steep downward slope with the levels of inequalities, with the levels of marginalization and exclusion, and we all know the problems. So we cannot wait 20 years. We need scale and we need speed. And for that, I truly believe that we need incremental just to the point of getting a foot in the door, and after that we need wholesale transformation. And that will only come if we have that foot in the door. So let's not be afraid to partner with governments. Let's not be afraid to collaborate. Let's not be afraid that we will be seen as sellouts. Let's not be afraid to talk to government. Dialogue is important, but at the same time preserving our integrity and our independence, building consensus, speaking with one voice on the big issues, but allowing others to come in, as many as possible, to create a truly pan-Indian movement is also equally important. Thank you.